Hello, and welcome to week 5 of Creative Empowerment over the Disenfranchised. I'm just going to share the screen with you. So, in the lecture this week, we're actually going to talk about the building of the anti-psychiatry movement. Our guest panel this week is actually going to provide an overarching perspective on the history of the anti-psychiatry movement, and will also provide a connection to and a broad perspective of the many different scholars who have also been involved in the anti-psychiatry movement as well. One of the presenters, Ifrat, has actually done significant research on the movement from a historical perspective, including a critical analysis of the movement, which voices are included and which voices are less present. So I'm not going to repeat what I know you will be hearing from them during our synchronous session. But what I would like to discuss today are some of the different forces that have built or contributed to the anti-psychiatry movement, and draw from your readings. And so our agenda today is to look at Bonnie Bristow in the anti-psychiatry movement, to look at the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault, so CAPA, and look at highlighted some of the actions that are representative of many of the actions of the anti-psychiatry movement. Then to look at the MAD movement, and we're going to draw from Starkman and Finkler's readings for this week, and then to look at the attrition movement. And then we'll finish off just with just a couple of comments on the article on Bell Talks, which takes a look at the event which just finished this past week from a critical perspective. So starting off this week, we're going to look at a major scholar in the anti-psychiatry movement, definitely in Canada, but I think a scholar who has made also a global contribution to the anti-psychiatry movement, and that is Bonnie Bristow. Why talk about one person and a movement? It wasn't just that Bonnie Bristow was my first introduction to the anti-psychiatry movement, or that she played an important role in the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault, but she has been quite a significant voice. She wrote prolifically and dedicated her scholarship to the movement, and engaged in the movement in activism from the time she was a graduate student. Bonnie Bristow actually passed away just over a year ago, and at the time a number of pictures came out, and these are some of my favorite pictures that came out at the time. And these are some pictures of Bonnie as a graduate student, with I think we probably, maybe all of us have done things on Bristol board. It still gets done, with psychiatry sex around her neck, and then Bonnie at some press releases around anti-psychiatry in the 1990s. She was a humanist, psychotherapist, and an author, and as I said before, an anti-psychiatry scholar. She was a professor at OISE. Some of you in your journeys at OISE, some of you have been around for a few years, others are just new coming to OISE. You may have encountered her during your time at OISE. She was always engaged in really supporting graduate students at OISE, and very active in the OISE community. She wrote both fiction and nonfiction books. She wrote her fiction books. She wrote The House on Lippincott Street and The Other Mrs. Smith, novels that dealt with trauma of the Holocaust and of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, respectively. Some other things of note were also her scholarly publications. And so they were critiques of psychiatry, like Psychiatry Disrupted, which is a collection of anti-psychiatry essays and articles. And then Psychiatry and the Business of Madness, which was a critique of the psychiatric industrial complex, something that she was writing just at the end of, as I was finishing off my PhD at OISE, and I remember her walking down the hallway. I would always get up after 2 hours of writing and working on my dissertation in my office at OISE. I would get up and just take a walk around for 10 minutes just to get a little bit of circulation going. And I think Bonnie must have been doing the same thing as she was finishing off working on her book at the same time. You probably recognize Bonnie's name on a number of the readings that were in both the required and the recommended readings from today. But you'll also recognize that her name figures into a number of the readings as well. So she's connected into the MAD movement from the beginning, and often was connected into many of the collections of scholarship that have come together, like Psychiatry Disrupted and Mad Matters, which are the collections that came together from the articles from today's readings. She was also really invested in contributing to the scholarship of students coming into OISE, and built up MAD scholarship within education at OISE as well, and had quite a following and built up that community at OISE as well. Bonnie supported many students in a number of different ways. And you'll note that in the Setting the Context piece, one of the things that I included additional information about was actually just a piece on the anti-psychiatry scholarship that Bonnie funded. So in 2016, she actually funded the first anti-psychiatry scholarship that was available globally, and actually to be awarded to students annually to conduct research in anti-psychiatry. And it provoked a lot of controversy at the University of Toronto and beyond the University of Toronto, particularly around academic freedom. It was criticized by mental health activists. There was an article in the Huffington Post in which the criticism happened but it also was praised by the Citizen Commission on Human Rights, and the criticism was that because it was connected to the Church of on Scientology. And in Bonnie's defense, she talked about this idea that these were bogus smear tactics. Bonnie also contributed a number of other scholarships as well. One into the Burstow Scholarship for research of violence against Indigenous women in memory of Helen Betty Osborne, for a graduate student whose thesis was actually focusing on violence against Indigenous women. And in 2019, she also created a scholarship for research on anti-Semitism. When she died, she was 74 years old, and was absolutely, her absence has been absolutely felt by the Oise community and the anti-psychiatry community. But her legacy absolutely lives on in her scholarships and in the significant contributions that she made to the building of the movement, and in the scholarships she set up to support future scholars and future activists. And I've included a number of readings as a part of the readings for this week that connect into some of the contributions that Bonnie Burstow made to the anti-psychiatry movement. A number of them connect into the structure of the movement and the future of the movement. And just moving forward, the Burstow article on that was in your required readings actually looked at so doing anti-psychiatry on all cylinders, possibilities, enigmas, and challenges. Bonnie Burstow actually looked at the anti-psychiatry movement and looked at what possibilities existed for the movement moving forward, and reflecting on the work that had been done in the time that she'd actually been involved in the movement. So she suggested that there were actually two different possible approaches. So what she said is, let me suggest that there are two overarching or umbrella approaches available to us as activists: persuasion on the one hand, and the application of political pressure on the other. And as she spoke about persuasion, she talked about this idea that, and as she defined persuasion, she talked about persuasion being providing information, telling our story, exposing and educating, and that close relationship between persuasion and change happening. And that experience tells us that this is actually possible. It's part of our, what she calls our existential nature, to try and persuade and to move others and to bring them into our camp. But the other thing that she says is that we can't, this is not something that is always always effective. And in fact, it is actually not always consistent. And there are challenges to only using persuasion. And the biggest challenge that she speaks to in her article is the politics of compassion, that when we tell a story and when we expose and we connect into someone's sympathy or their empathy, it's possible that that change can be short-lived, because the politics of compassion can absolutely shift. And the example that Burstow gave in her article was Bryan's Law, so legislation that happened as a result of a death that was connected to a patient that had some mental health challenges, and Bryan was the person who lost his life. And so Brian's law actually lowered the threshold on involuntary incarceration. So even though there had been a lot of gains made around exposing some of the inconsistencies and the violence within the psychiatric system, all of those gains were lost when the politics of compassion shifted. And so the other question that Bonnie asked was, does education need to be more radical to be successful? So do our methods of educating people, if they were more radical and if they were more thorough, would that actually cause our movements to be more successful? And she actually says that this might be disappointing, that just because we get more radical doesn't mean necessarily that we will actually net better results, that in fact there may need to be a two-pronged approach for change to happen. And so she suggests that persuasion is not enough because of all of the players. And in the case of the anti-psychiatry movement, she names players like multinational pharmaceutical companies, armies of professional helpers, the entire psychiatric and psychopharmaceutical industrial complex, that there are a lot of things, a lot of different players who have a lot at stake. And so political pressure in a particular area might be something that needs to be considered. And so what she suggests is that because the oppressor wields power, and because within a movement like the anti-psychiatry movement, you're trying to overturn a system, so from the counter-hegemonic standpoint, that from that standpoint, you also need to wield power. So how does that happen? Well, she doesn't suggest that physical force is the answer, but nonviolent action, such as, she says, the kind of nonviolent action that is waged by visionaries like Gandhi, that kind of action is the kind of action that can apply political pressure, and by which significant change and more long-term change may happen. And so Bonnie talks about the importance of leverage and also connecting with allies. So who are your allies? So some of the examples that Bonnie gave in the article were a hunger strike that an organization called Mind Freedom, which is part of the anti-psychiatry movement, engaged in, as well as just different civil rights tactics that have been engaged in over the years by the anti-psychiatry movement. And in thinking about leverage, Bonnie's example was, for example, if children are being placed on Ritalin and children are being labeled as having ADHD, then children are being controlled and subdued chemically in classrooms around the world. Well, then maybe here's where a powerful symbol lies. So what if we leveraged it properly? Could it be that the public at large might rally in protection of its children? And were that possible in the long run, might a focus like this actually deliver the numbers that were needed for a strategic action? So where does political pressure, where can political pressure take place? Where does it need to take place within the anti-psychiatry movement? And then in terms of thinking about in terms of thinking about allies, who historically have our allies been, and thinking about that in a movement. And so that's not even thinking about allies within a movement. And we've talked a lot in this course about allies within a movement. So you might have people who are members of a movement who consider themselves to be, for example, in the anti-psychiatry movement, people who are psychiatric survivors and people who are allies, who come alongside them, who say this movement is important. And so, but not even thinking about it even more broadly than that. So the example that Bonnie gave in her article was, who historically have ally movements been, and how could we work together to leverage support? So thinking about that intersection of need and of purpose. So some of the examples that she gave were homelessness activists or prison abolitionists and Quakers, and who might new allies be? So how could movements work together to apply political pressure and to create the potential for change? One of the things that Bonnie was instrumental in founding, with many of the people that you will see as contributors to within Mad Matters and also in Psychiatry Disrupted, was the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assaults, CAPA. And I've mentioned that this group a couple of times as a potential group that you can connect with for your project if you're interested. Also, they are coming to, representatives from the group are coming to talk with us on February 8th as our first panel. So who is the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault? Well, they were formed in 2003, and they are a coalition of people who are committed to dismantling the psychiatric system and building a better world. And this is from the mandate from their website. They are radical and visionary, comprised of activists, psychiatric survivors, dramatists, academics, and professionals. They're focused on strategic activism and no direct service. And their membership and is that you must be anti-psychiatry or critical psychiatry. And some of the other important things in terms of their mandate, and this is their mandate statement. We see problems in living which are currently pathologized as largely created by sexism, capitalism, racism, ableism, heterosexism, and other systemic oppressions. We see the very concept of mental illness as flawed. We object to incarceration, electroshock, and the vast array of brain-damaging drugs. We oppose the violation of human rights, which is endemic to psychiatry. And we see a connection between globalization, intolerance, and the mass marketing of the mental health industry. The world in which we strive to co-create is one where people are not pathologized, where care is neither commodified nor professionalized, where choice and integrity are respected, and where we are all joined in caring and creative community to each other and to the planet Earth. And so there are a number of actions, and one of the things that I wanted to do in terms of talking about CAPA is to look at some of the things that have been significant to the anti-psychiatry movement. And so I've just highlighted some actions. And so actions like Occupy Psychiatry, and in 2012, CAPA was part of Occupy Psychiatry, which was a nonviolent action during which survivors and activists occupied the front grounds for CAMH at 250 College Street. And in the spirit of the Occupy movement, they took up space with Occupy symbols, complete with speeches, testimonies, and entertainment and food in protest of psychiatric imperialism. And Kappa actually held this in solidarity with Boycott Normal, Occupy American Psychiatric Association, which happened in Philadelphia. But there were movements like this that happened all over the US and in some different cities in Canada as well, which were connected to the Occupy movement, but with a specific focus on psychiatric institutions. Another thing that has been very connected to the anti-psychiatry movement is the promotion of scholarship. And so, just for example, two of the books that chapters or readings came out of this for this week were, one was Mad Matters, another one was Psychiatry Disrupted, and then another being Psychiatry in the Business of Madness, which was challenging the dominant medical model in mental health, and looking at the business, Psychiatry and Business of Madness was an institutional ethnography of the psychiatric industrial complex. And building an anti-psychiatry library. And there is at OISE, whenever the building is a space that can be connected to again, there is a really extensive anti-psychiatry library that is now housed at OISE and is curated by Kappa. And you, as an OISE student or as a community member, can have access to that library as well. Another large action that has happened on a regular basis for the last 13 years is an action called Stop Shocking Our Mothers and Grandmothers. And this is an action that has been connected to different feminist and social groups worldwide. And they've gathered together during the month of May to raise awareness about the medical risk and also sexist facts that are surrounding electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. And Kappa traditionally holds their rally against ECT on Mother's Day in front of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario at Queen's Park. What is the purpose of this? Well, the purpose is that in Ontario and elsewhere, and you may have noticed that I wasn't able to provide a video of one of the Kappa rallies, but these rallies happen actually in different places all over Canada and the US, and I included a video in the Setting the Context page that was actually happening in Alaska, which happened to be filmed. And it's a time when people share their testimonies, people who experienced ECT, and very often women are represent about 70% of the people who experience ECT, and often it is used as a treatment for different mental health, and I'm going to put this in quotations, mental health disorders, as a way to alleviate those symptoms. And they're administered to increasingly to elderly women and to women who suffer from postpartum symptoms as well. And so, so that's part of the stop shocking our mothers and grandmothers. And so just some examples of some of those rallies at Queen's Park. And these are from the Kappa website. And some of these date all the way back to the times when I was actually involved in the different rallies I made, even worked on some of those posters. I wish that I had, pictures eventually disappear in this digital age, but at one point we had giant 11-foot puppets that we used as part of a demonstration at Queen's Park all the way back in 2007 that were part of that action. And there was also often a press release involved with this, and a connection to different news outlets as well that connected to this movement as well. So the other piece that's really significant to the anti-psychiatry movement is the entire MAD movement. And MAD studies is actually an emerging interdisciplinary field that's mainly in the social sciences and humanities. Sometimes you would see MAD studies emerging out of different faculties that are looking at disability studies as well. But they're expressing a radical new voice in the academy about madness, challenging ideas that we have about sanity and about what saneness actually is. And this whole area of MAD studies is often contradicting many years of psychiatric biases about madness, and they're based on a simple idea. Listen to mad people and look at madness from their points of view, which is the counter-hegemonic point of view. I taught a course a number of years ago, and I remember students asking me some of the same questions that you might be asking, which is maybe the word mad discriminatory to call something, a whole area of studies, mad? Mad was a word that was used in, it's definitely a stigma attached to it, and certainly was not a positive word. So if someone was mad, that certainly wasn't speaking to their value. So the language is definitely political, and it represents a radical new voice. Mad people reclaim the word mad the same way that gay people did with queer and gay in the 1970s and the 1980s, showing the context and the history and oppression around human distress and extreme mental states. So the word mad kind of makes you stop and say, what? And that space of sudden confusion says, maybe there's a chance that we could change that subject. And so using the word mad is about reclaiming space and about disrupting. And so in Mad Matters, Starkman talks about the beginning of the movement, and he talked about for how long madness had been, and people who were mad had been discriminated against. He talked about the fact that people who saw visions at one point before the 1500s had actually been called visionaries, but that faded very quickly, and they were absolutely marginalized and stigmatized. And there was a quote in Mel Startman's article by Chamberlain: "For too long, mental patients have been faceless and voiceless people." And Mel Starkman was one of the first people in Canada to actually advocate for the creation of a MAD movement, and that was in the 1980s. But he talked about in his article about the importance of radical therapists as allies in the 1970s. And I appreciated, and the reason I chose this article is that it actually provided a really interesting snapshot of the different ways in which these liberation movements grew globally. And some of the important language to consider when you're thinking about the MAD movement are when you're talking about the psychiatric system, is that within the MAD movement, you may notice, even just from this one article, that psychiatric survivors refer to themselves as inmates, and their time within the psychiatric system as incarceration, and words like involuntary are brought up on a regular basis as well. And so you see also this connection to the incarceral system and the prison system, and as well in terms of those two movements. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Finkler's article was all about was looking at the idea of group homes, and her article was from Psychiatry Disrupted, and was about critiquing structures and the importance of critiquing existing structures that shape the lives of psychiatric survivors, and using tools like research to support that process. And so you see there are different ways to be an ally, and I would suggest, in fact, that research can be a really important tool in supporting movements. But then throughout her article, this idea of interrogating different terms and different words was rewriting the narrative and redefining terms like home and family in looking at communities that are connected into group homes, and pushing the boundaries of what that might look like in terms of from the perspective of land reform, and the importance of for a movement of people connecting into many different areas and many different spaces and places, and the contributions that you can make, whether it is in land reform, whether it is in direct action, but that everyone can contribute to rewriting the narrative. So we are nearing the end of our conversation today, but I wanted to just end with some final thoughts from Bonnie Burstow, actually. And this is actually from looking at a nutrition model from a Psych Out conference that happened in May of 2010. And Bonnie Bristow gave a keynote speech and talked about an attrition model rather than the abolition of psychiatry. Instead talked about an attrition model, recognizing that completely abolishing psychiatry isn't going to happen overnight. But what does that mean for a movement? And here were some of her thoughts. I included in a number of places in your asynchronous work, this asynchronous module this week, places for you to access Bonnie's keynote speech on the attrition model. The psychiatry attrition model. So what exactly is an attrition model? Well, an attrition model assumes that nothing as extensive and entrenched as the institution in question can actually happen or can change really quickly. And that something as ambitious as abolition takes place slowly and for the most part through attrition. So by gradual and persistent rubbing away and wearing down. And not all change that seems positive actually has the capacity to bring a movement closer to the abolitionist goal. And indeed, on the contrary, some of what looks promising would actually undermine the long-term goal in question. And so one of the things that Bonnie does in her keynote speech is to give some defining questions in looking at the direction of a movement and thinking about actions that the movement is taking. So what she suggests is, if successful, will the actions or campaigns that we are contemplating move us closer to the long-range goal of psychiatry abolition? And number two, are they likely to avoid improving or giving added legitimacy to the current system? And number three, do they avoid widening psychiatry's net? So it's providing some defining questions and providing a little bit of a base and direction in knowing how do you get to that eventual goal. You might not have a plan to know exactly where you should go, but having guiding questions to help you get to that place are very helpful in thinking from the perspective of an attrition model when you are thinking about dismantling a system that is powerful and has lots of powerful players involved. It also doesn't require you to have everything figured out all at once. So I told you that we would just briefly look at the Bell Let's Talk article, and I put that article in because it was timely. I think it's a good article because it challenges it challenges us to think through what we are consuming, and so that's what I really like about Peter's article, and it's a critique on the Bell Let's Talk campaign, so the article, if you've read it, identifies a number of ways in which the campaign falls short of creating long-term sustainable change, and in the midst of running the campaign excludes different groups of people and capitalizes on the effective labor of others. And so I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Is it possible for a corporation to create long-term sustainable change if they're not part of a movement? And the other question I would ask is, can a revolution be funded? And I'm going to come back to those questions, but to what extent, who can be like, so I guess the bigger question is, who is it that can be an ally in the midst of in the midst of a movement, and who is uh, who do campaigns like Bell Let's Talk serve, and despite the fact that there may be good things that it's doing, it's always good to ask the question, who is it serving? So those are some questions that I will just leave you with today. And our synchronous session on February 8th had a good conversation with Oriel, who is coordinating the group from Kappa that's coming. We're going to have Oriel, Efrat, Stephen, and Julie joining us from Kappa on February the 8th. They're going to be talking about the history of the anti-psychiatry movement, and including some personal narratives as well. And this is going to be the first of our guest speaker panels and can be used as a partial fulfillment for assignment number 1. You have the opportunity to choose 2 of the 5 guest speaker panels to reflect on. And thank you so much for once again sharing this time with me. And I wish you a wonderful week and look forward to our synchronous session. Thanks so much.